point. It continues online at cspan.org. And also, we encourage your remarks on the Benghazi investigation at the hashtag #CSpanChat. And now live to the U.S. House, gaveling in for legislative business this afternoon.
The House will be in order. Prayer will be offered today by our guest chaplain, Reverend Dale Ribble, Oak Lake Church, Lincoln, Nebraska.
O Lord, you have been our dwelling place from the foundation of our country. We ask for wisdom from you, the all-wise God, for these leaders as they seek to lead our country. Your word tells us that wisdom is from above, is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. You have said that a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. May these men and women be united in wisdom that leads to peace. O Lord, may we, as a nation who has known the greatness of your mercy and grace, not stray from seeking you in your righteous ways. For you have said, blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. Keep us in the shelter of your wings and turn our hearts to you. In Jesus' name, amen.
The Chair has examined a journal of the last day's proceedings and announces to the House his approval thereof. Pursuant to Clause 1 of Rule 1, the journal stands approved. The Pledge of Allegiance today will be led by the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Wahlberg.
Please join in the pledge to our flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Without objection, the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Ribble, is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am the youngest son of 6 sons, all children of an ordained Baptist minister. I have 5 older brothers. 4 of those are still alive today. 3 of them have responded to the call of ministry and are pastors. One of my own sons, Clint, is also a pastor. It's impossible to separate my faith heritage from my daily life. My brother Dale Ribble, who is our guest chaplain today, is exactly the same. From my earliest childhood memories, Dale was destined for ministry. As a child, I observed him on countless times reaching out to people around him, both young and old, with a spirit of compassion and concern. He is a gift given to him by God for this purpose. The work that churches do in our communities change and affect lives for the positive. They reach out to the poor, the sick, the hungry, improving the lives of whom they touch and enriching our communities. I've watched Dale do these things his entire life. I'm proud of his work and thank him for being with us today. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The Chair will entertain 15 further requests for 1-minute speeches on each side of the aisle. Does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition?
Speaker, unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, there was a time when the Southern Poverty Law Center was a laudable civil rights organization boldly combating bigotry and extremism. Such noble pursuits have been cast aside for partisan politics, and today the SPLC is better known for their attacks on Judeo-Christian groups. Recently, the SPLC has targeted the Alabama Accountability Act, a school choice law passed earlier this year. Under this act, Alabama provides tax credit scholarships for students at failing schools so that they can attend better performing schools, private, religious, and non-failing public schools. Rather than allow students a chance at a good education, the SPLC has filed a lawsuit that would trap students in schools the state's own accountability system has graded D or F. In other words, if you can't help every child, you can't help any child. How absurd. Mr. Speaker, it's time for this intolerance to end, and it's time that Congress and the American people embrace policies that allows parents and students the opportunity to choose the type of education that fosters success. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. What purpose does the gentleman from Rhode Island rise?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, 9 months after the tragedy at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Connecticut, our country is once again facing the terrible reality of another horrific mass shooting. In this case, 12 innocent men and women were murdered at the Washington Navy Yard just 2 days ago. I know that all of us are keeping the victims and their loved ones in our thoughts and prayers today. All of us in this chamber should ask ourselves whether there is anything that we could have done to prevent this tragedy. According to the Associated Press, the person who carried out this cowardly attack had previously complained about serious mental health issues, including paranoia, sleep disorder, and hearing voices in his head. And despite all of this, he legally purchased a shotgun from a firearms dealer in Virginia just last week. Mr. Speaker, there is something seriously wrong in this country when someone with such serious mental illness is able to purchase a firearm without even the slightest bit of scrutiny. We owe it to the victims at the Navy Yard and their families to finally close loopholes that allow criminals and the seriously mentally ill to purchase firearms. How many tragedies should we witness before we finally enact common sense gun violence prevention? I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. For what purpose the gentleman from South Carolina rise?
Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute, revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, this morning, South Carolina Attorney General Alan Wilson testified before a joint committee on Capitol Hill, warning that the health care takeover legislation is a threat to security and safety of citizens. The Attorney General cited, despite the President saying last month we are well on our way to fully implementing the Affordable Care Act, important deadlines are being routinely missed. In order for the ACA to adequately determine the eligibility, it must create a data hub that connects databases from 7 different agencies. However, the hub has not been beta tested, independently verified, or properly audited. When it goes live on October 1, it will be a con man's all-you-can-eat buffet, overflowing with a goldmine of sensitive information from the agency databases. Attorney General Wilson summarized, until HHS rectifies safeguarding Americans' personal information, Congress must suspend implementation of ACA. In conclusion, God bless our troops, and we will never forget September 11th and the global war on terrorism.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. For what purpose the gentlewoman from California rise? Without objection, the gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to celebrate not only Hispanic Heritage Month, but to celebrate the next generation of Hispanic leaders. I applaud the National PTA for naming September the month of the Hispanic child. With the Hispanic population totaling 53 million people in the U.S., Hispanic children and youth are the fastest growing population in America. By 2060, it's projected that Hispanics will be about 128 million people in the United States. In order to produce the next generation of leaders that are capable and equipped to work and to tackle our future challenges, we must invest in every Hispanic child. Education and equal opportunity are what will ensure that these students fulfill the American promise. I will continue to advocate for programs like Head Start and fight to make college more affordable for all children. And as we celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month, let us keep in mind that the young generation will be our leaders of the future. And I yield back.
One from California rise.
For 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I was deeply saddened to see the President begin the 6th year of our nation's economic malaise by renewing his partisan name-calling and finger-pointing on Monday. Fortunately, we have a model for bipartisan economic cooperation. In 1995, when President Clinton realized that his policies weren't working, he reached across the aisle to work with the Republican House, and despite their political differences, they did some amazing things. They reduced federal spending by a miraculous 4% of GDP. They produced the largest capital gains tax cut in American history. They reformed entitlement spending by abolishing the open-ended welfare system we had at the time. They delivered 4 years of budget surpluses. These bipartisan policies produced a period of prolonged economic expansion and unprecedented prosperity for America's middle and working classes. Republicans have been eager to repeat these successful bipartisan policies of the Clinton years. Why isn't the President?
The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Ohio rise? Without objection, the gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in strong opposition of H.R. 3102, the Republican Nutrition Reform and Work Opportunity Act. America should be uncomfortable because this bill would cut $40 billion in critical nutrition assistance programs, denying SNAP benefits to at least 4 million low-income Americans, affecting children, seniors, the disabled, and veterans. America should be uncomfortable because this Republican bill affects unemployed adults with an average income of just $2,500 per year and would immediately lose their SNAP benefits. America should be uncomfortable because this bill hurts Americans living in rural, urban, and suburban areas. For many, SNAP benefits are the only thing that keeps them from living with hunger and malnutrition and sickness. America should be uncomfortable. We should not cut these funds. These are extreme cuts. One of the most effective programs we have combating hunger.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from California rise? Without objection, the gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. I rise today in opposition of H.R. 3102, the Nutrition Reform and Work Opportunity Act. Contrary to the rhetoric of my Republican colleagues, the overwhelming majority of SNAP recipients who can work do so. Among SNAP households with an able-bodied adult, more than 50% work while receiving SNAP benefits. They just do not earn enough money to provide food for their families. In my district in Los Angeles, nearly 77% of families receiving SNAP benefits in my district are working families. The Republican attack on SNAP is a sad example of not understanding the struggles faced by so many Americans, including many of their own constituents. SNAP benefits help low-wage working families make ends meet as they try to get back on their feet. Millions of families rely on SNAP as they struggle with unemployment, low wages in the wake of the recession. The House Republican proposal would recklessly cut assistance for at least 4 to 6 million people who need help, and we cannot let this happen. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back the balance of her time. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York rise?
Seek unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, September is National Preparedness Month, and Mr. Speaker, preparedness includes making sure that the public has access to timely information in cases of emergency. For many Americans, public broadcasting is a vital source of important emergency announcements. Over 98% of the American population has access to public radio or a television signal. In times of emergency, public broadcasting is a go-to source of information for emergency management officials and first responders. We have a responsibility to ensure that stations that are damaged in a disaster are repaired and operational as quickly as possible. That's why I've introduced the Emergency Information Improvement Act. My bill clarifies that local public radio and television stations are eligible for assistance to rebuild their facilities when they are damaged in a federally designated disaster, such as a storm or terrorist attack. This legislation will help ensure that the important informational resource will be available to the Americans in times of need. I invite my colleagues to support this legislation.
The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida rise?
Speaker, I rise to address the House for 1 minute, and I ask permission to revise and extend my.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to express my strong support for the SNAP program, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. SNAP is a critically important program. It helps struggling families put food on the table while they work to get back on their feet. It helps our nation's most vulnerable, as nearly 2/3 of recipients are children, elderly, and disabled. And according to new census data just released yesterday, the SNAP program helped lift 4 million people out of poverty in 2012. Additionally, this is a multiplier of 2.5 times in our economy. Unfortunately, it is my understanding that the House of Representatives may soon consider legislation that cuts $40 billion in funding from SNAP. This is the wrong approach. At a time when many families and communities are still struggling to get back on their feet from the Great Recession, we should be working to strengthen, not undermine, the SNAP program. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back to balance.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. For what purpose the gentlewoman from New Hampshire rise?
To address the House for 1 minute, Mr. Speaker.
Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today with a heavy heart because this body will soon consider a bill that will cut 4 million children from their nutrition benefits. Americans will go hungry. In my district and across this country, these are our friends, our neighbors, our fellow parishioners. They are children and veterans and seniors. One of my constituents wrote to me recently about how federal nutrition assistance is essential to feeding her family. She is 28 years old, disabled, and an orphan, so she has no family to fall back upon, and she is the mother of a toddler. On top of all that, she's in college working to get her undergraduate degree, and a double major, no less. But right now, she depends on supplemental nutrition assistance programs to feed her toddler. And that assistance doesn't even go far enough. She still has to rely on our local food bank and other community assistance. This is who we are talking about when we debate cutting $40 billion from nutrition programs. We can and should do better.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from California rise? Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to call attention to the seriousness of the proposed $40 billion cut to the nutrition bill. As a member of the House Agriculture Committee, I am gravely concerned with this bill as it circumvented proper deliberation before the Agriculture Committee. This bill lacks the transparency required by the American people and is outside the custom and practice of all past farm bills this House has passed. I am ready to vote for a farm bill, but we are no closer to finding a compromise than we were 6 months ago. This issue is about Americans' ability to eat as our country struggles to come out of the greatest financial crisis since the Great Depression. SNAP is a vital food in empowering Americans in a challenging economy and should not be the sole factor in solving the nation's long-term fiscal problems. Costs for the programs will shrink as the economy improves and people are able to do exactly what Americans want to do: put food on the table. I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Florida rise?
I ask the gentleman consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, we wonder why people need nutrition assistance in the first place. Well, it's because our minimum wage is inadequate and because government has given up on creating jobs. A parent working full-time at minimum wage will simply not earn enough income to cover basic needs. SNAP recipients are not lazy. It's this Congress that's lazy. Mr. Speaker, if you want to cut $40 billion in nutrition funding, I have a two-part plan for you. Raise the minimum wage so workers can feed themselves. Pass the American Jobs Act so Americans can find work in the first place. Mr. Speaker, the working poor, seniors, and children are suffering now, and you plan to cut nutrition assistance? Not only will they suffer, but some may die. It's time for this Congress to address the real issues. Raise the minimum wage and jobs, jobs, jobs.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey rise?
Remarks and address the House
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not one to go on and on about a lot of statistics, but as we debate the nutrition bill, there is one that struck a chord with me. 1 in 4, yes, 1 in 4 children go to bed hungry every night. And I'm not talking about Africa, China, or India. I'm talking about 1 in 4 children who live right here in the United States who go to sleep without adequate nutrition. For me and the 1 million New Jerseyans on SNAP, this is a complete and total outrage. We live in the greatest country on earth, yet 17 million children in this country do not get the nutrition they need. Last year alone, SNAP lifted 4 million people out of poverty. The bill on the floor this week, which would cut SNAP by nearly $40 billion, will only ensure that these people are pushed right back into poverty. That's why I strongly oppose the Nutrition Assistance Bill, and I urge my colleagues to examine their conscience and remember that when they cast their vote, they are casting their vote for or against 1 in 4 children who still go to bed at night hungry.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to express strong opposition to H.R. 3102, what I call the Attack on Poor, Disadvantaged, and Hungry Peoples Act. This bill will cut food stamps by $40 billion. And as a result of that, at least 4 million low-income individuals will no longer be eligible to receive nutrition assistance. I say shame on whoever concocted this draconian idea, whoever put this proposal together, and certainly shame on us if we vote for it. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Alabama rise? Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to to express my strong opposition to H.R. 3102, calling for $4 billion worth of cuts in critically needed funding for nutrition assistance programs. You know, Mr. Speaker, struggling to encourage my Republican colleagues to take a walk in the shoes of those who suffer from food insecurity has become uncomfortably common in this chamber. In this House, we have moved beyond poor economic doctrine and immoral social policy, and we're now dealing with the very dangerous mindset that the weakest in our society are to blame for their condition. You know, instead of taking away food stamps, we should be encouraging jobs. We should be encouraging smaller assistance for those who are in need is not, I think, the way that this policy should go. We should be incentivizing companies to provide a living wage, and I think it's hypocritical for us to value the sanctity of life while neglecting policies that ensure all Americans have a better quality of life. 54% of the households in my district have SNAP. I think that it's really important that we remember the people that we're sent here to represent.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from New Mexico rise? Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I recently met with some constituents from New Mexico whose lives have been impacted by pancreatic cancer, the deadliest of all major forms of cancer. It's not easy to hear a woman talk about losing her husband, a sister talk about losing her brother, or even a father talk about losing his daughter. It's not easy to listen to their stories, but it's important, and here's why. Pancreatic cancer is the 4th leading cause of cancer deaths in this country. The 5-year survival rate is just 6%, and there are still no early detection tools or life-saving treatments. Last year, Democrats and Republicans came together to pass the Recalcitrant Cancer Research Act, which requires the National Cancer Institute to develop a scientific framework for combating both pancreatic cancer and lung cancer. Unfortunately, the much-needed progress we stand to make is in serious jeopardy, largely because of sequestration. The National Cancer Institute's budget has been drastically cut. This is simply unacceptable, and it's yet another reason why I continue to call for a permanent fix to sequestration. The country deserves better. I yield back.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Hawaii rise?
Mr. Speaker, I request unanimous consent to address the House.
Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, sometimes we use words like SNAP and people don't know what it means. SNAP means Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. It's supplemental to what people receive. Nutrition, that's the main purpose, and it just gives assistance. What we're proposing to vote on is a bill that will cut $40 billion from SNAP. What it means, and this is something that's very important for us to recognize, is it means children will lose access to things like free school lunches. Free school lunches. For some children, that's the best meal of the day that they have. We know hundreds of thousands will lose that. 1.7 million people, 850,000 households will be reduced by $90 a month. Think about your own budgets and think about what $90 a month will mean for a family that needs assistance. And in addition, this bill will ask that disabled people work 20 hours a week before they can even qualify for supplemental nutrition assistance.
Gentlewoman's
Mr.
time
Speaker,
has expired.
this is a mean-spirited measure, and Congress should not be defined by that.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Utah rise?
Mr. Speaker, by direction of the Committee on Rules, I call up House Resolution 347 and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the resolution.
House Calendar Number 53, House Resolution 347, resolved that at any time after the adoption of this resolution, the Speaker may, pursuant to Clause 2B of Rule 18, declare the House resolved into the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for consideration of the bill H.R. 761, to require the Secretary of the Interior and the Secretary of Agriculture to more efficiently develop domestic sources of the minerals and mineral materials of strategic and critical importance to United States economic and national security and manufacturing competitiveness. The first reading of the bill shall be dispensed with. All points of order against consideration of the bill are waived. General debate shall be confined to the bill and shall not exceed 1 hour, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Natural Resources. After general debate, the bill shall be considered for amendment under the 5-minute rule. It shall be in order to consider as an original bill for the purpose of amendment under the 5-minute rule the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on Natural Resources now printed in the bill. The committee amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read. All points of order against the committee amendment in the nature of a substitute are waived. No amendment to the committee amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be in order except those printed in the report of the Committee on Rules accompanying this resolution. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question in the House or in the Committee of the Whole. All points of order against such amendments are waived. At the conclusion of consideration of the bill for amendment, the committee shall rise and report the bill to the House with such amendments as may have been adopted. Any member may demand a separate vote in the House on any amendment adopted in the Committee of the Whole to the bill or to the committee amendment in the nature of a substitute. The previous question shall be considered as ordered on the bill and amendments thereto to final passage without intervening motion except one motion to recommit with or without instructions.
The gentleman from Utah is recognized for 1 hour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For purposes of debate only, I will yield the customary 30 minutes to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Hastings, pending which I yield myself such time as I may consume. During the consideration of this resolution, all time yielded is for purpose of debate only, and I ask that all members have 5 legislative days in which they may revise and extend their remarks.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. This resolution provides for a structured rule for consideration of H.R. 761, the National Strategic Critical Mineral Production Act. Provides an hour of general debate, equally divided between both sides. Provides for 5 amendments, 4 of which are Democrat amendments and 1 is a Republican amendment. So this rule is fair to a fault, and it is totally generous, and will provide a balanced and open debate as long as we as members structure our regards to the merits of this particular bill and don't go off on tangents. Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to be able to stand before the House and support this rule. It's a good rule. I also support the underlying bill, H.R. 761. And I want to congratulate the gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Amadei, as sponsor of this particular piece of legislation, as well as the chairman of the Natural Resources Committee, Mr. Hastings of Washington, for his leadership in this particular effort. Mr. Speaker, our nation is blessed with an abundance of resources which has made us a leading world economy industrial power, and we have only scratched the surface, very literally, of what we can potentially develop. We have energy potential such as coal and oil shale and natural gas deposits, as well as various critical minerals that we as a nation need and should be developing. But unfortunately, much of this development has been, of our domestic mineral resources, has actually been stymied by a combination of special interest politics as well as bureaucratic red tape, particularly under this administration. It is a pain we are all seeing coming. 25 years ago, 20% of all money that was spent for development and production of critical minerals was spent here in the United States. Today, that's down to only 8%, as other nations have replaced our efforts, unfortunately. This has meant an increase in our trade imbalance, dollars going overseas, escalating prices here at home for both energy and commodities. It means job losses here in the United States. And ironically, these jobs that we are losing are some of the highest paying middle-class jobs that are available. Bureaucratic delays are causing this, and they are causing us to see a change both for manufacturing and defense. 25 years ago, there were 30 minerals that we actually had to import to this nation that were considered critical minerals. Today, that number has gone from 30 to 61. 25 years ago, there were 16 minerals that we imparted a great majority of. Today, that number has gone to 24. It affects manufacturing, such as electronics and metal alloys, ceramics, glass, magnets, catalysts, everything. It affects our defense as well, as our Defense Logistic Agency tries to stockpile these minerals so the demands are there when we actually need them. Unfortunately, as we have illustrated, more and more of these are being purchased from overseas. They are critical to our weapon development system, including such things as night vision equipment, advanced lasers, avionics, fighter jet components, missile-guided systems, and the norm goes on and on. Look, the Constitution tells us that our first responsibility is to provide for a common defense. This bill steps us into the right direction, so we actually can provide for a common defense and do it intelligently and avoid unnecessary and frivolous delays. There are some that will criticize us from the kinds of minerals that we are placing in this restriction area. There was a study in 2009 that was done called the Great California Shakeup, which was a mock of what could happen if the big earthquake actually hit that area, and found out that in an effort to try and rebuild the infrastructure that would be necessary, there's a whole list of things we normally don't consider as critical that would in that situation be critical, including sand and gravel that we simply would have a frightful deficiency of if we were trying to rebuild under those types of critical situations. This bill anticipates that and makes sure that we will not be found lacking either in defense or in manufacturing or in critical civilian needs in case of disaster. This bill doesn't predetermine anything. It simply says, make a decision, yes or no, on whether this project should go forward. Simply make a decision and do it in a timely fashion. We still today average between 7 and 10 years in which those decisions are made. This bill says that that is unrealistic, and it simply says you got 30 months, 2.5 years, to make a decision, yes or no. If you have to have an extension, it provides for that on common agreement, which is only rational to do, but for heaven's sakes, finally make a decision. It is based on not only what we are talking about here, but it's based on what we are doing in our transportation area. It's based on a presidential concept. When the President established an Executive Order number 13604, which talked about the importance of trying to streamline, reform, and reference our process. This is the basis of what we are attempting to do in this particular bill as well. This implies that whenever there are agencies, multiple agencies involved in a project, that there must be a lead agency which must take the responsibility of actually getting the job done. So that any kind of environmental statement should be being done concurrently, not sequentially. That we can make sure that any kind of lawsuit does not stop the process of making a decision. Once again, this is one of those things that simply is logical. Just make a decision. You have plenty of time to do it. Make a decision. There is no reason we cannot make a decision on whether to go forward on a project in 2.5 years. None whatsoever. The fact that we are dragging our feet is simply done from bureaucratic excess that is illogical and irrational. We have done this in other areas. This is the time to do this in this area as well. If indeed we could do this process, it would be very clear that this nation would prosper, we could have good paying jobs, and we could make the desert blossom. I will reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Florida.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank my friend, the gentleman from Utah, for yielding me the customary 30 minutes. And, Mr. Speaker, I would ask to be able to use such time as I deem necessary.
Without objection.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, the House faces a number of pressing issues that everybody in America knows that we should be addressing. Instead, we are here today on Rule 347, a structured rule, and the underlying bill, H.R. 761, the National Strategic and Critical Minerals Production Act of 2013. I get it that my friends from areas that have these minerals in public spaces would like for us to proceed apace to extract them. I understand their feelings. I come from yet another of the critical areas of our country that we have to protect much of the space, and that would be the Everglades. I don't understand why Congress is trying to provide even more breaks to the United States mining operations when we do have these urgent domestic issues that we are confronted with, and somehow or another that we aren't able to undertake. We haven't done all of our appropriations. We are having difficulty getting a continuing resolution. We will soon be faced with lifting the debt ceiling. And somehow or another, we are dealing with something that, I might add, we have voted on before, that came out of the House of Representatives, that did not pass the Senate, and 761 is not going to pass the Senate either. So 761 guts important environmental protections offered through the National Environment Policy Act, referred to as NEPA. It fails to require adequate financial assurance, and I will have an amendment on the floor that will address that subject, and offers other benefits to mining companies. Mining operations in the United States benefit already from multiple federal tax breaks, exemptions to regulation under existing environmental laws, and no royalty payments to the United States for mining operations, even on U.S. lands. Mining companies limit their liability for environmental restoration and clean up by operating with U.S. subsidiaries to foreign parent companies. This relationship shields the parent company from liability and has allowed parent companies to draw profits from United States mining operations. So what happens when companies do not pay for environmental damage caused by their operations?
the people of the United States pay. They pay through a contaminated environment. They pay through sickness, including cancer. They pay through taxes, because taxpayer dollars are ultimately needed to clean up these sites. It would seem that we should have learned from our mistakes with the 1872 General Mining Law. Mining companies should be held accountable so that their operations will not impose additional burdens on the American people. H.R. 761 not only takes away valued natural resources for hiking, fishing, canoeing, and other recreational activities, it shifts the burdens of mining cleanup and restoration to the American taxpayer. Furthermore, H.R. 761 classifies domestic mining operations for strategic and critical minerals on federal lands as infrastructure projects. Using a broad definition that encompasses virtually every type of mine, this legislation allows mines to take advantage of a presidential order from 2012 which requires federal agencies to streamline the permitting process for infrastructure projects. However, building a mine is not the same as building roads and highways that are much needed in this country, or replacing rotted sewerage that is much needed in this country, which is, in fact, the country's infrastructure. Bills like this are why, in my opinion, the American people are so frustrated with us here in the United States Congress. We have a number of issues that we could, no, not that we could, that we should be working on. And yet we are rehashing a bill that went nowhere last Congress, ain't going to go nowhere this Congress, and most importantly, is bad for the nation. Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Utah.
Yield myself.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you. I just want to make a couple of comments before we go on with the discussion of this particular rule, which once again is a fair rule, and it is a good rule. But at no time, this bill is one of those bills that has no significant cost to the budget. At no time does this stop any of the NEPA requirements. All it says is do your job and do it on time. Nothing big about that, simply what those regulations are. And it is obviously one of those things that takes place that we desperately need, both for the manufacturing sector as well as for the defense. Like, I'm old. I still use legal pads. I trust those. They never crash on me. But if you have an iPhone or an iPad or any of that other kind of new stuff that my kids like to have, you're going to have these critical minerals. And if we are not proposing and developing them here in the United States, we are paying more to develop them out of country, and we're putting ourselves manufacturing-wise in a significant deficit situation. And obviously with the defense, what we're happening is even more critical. This is simply taking the executive order and saying, yeah, it's good for infrastructure, it's also good for our critical mineral development system, and saying, do the job. Do it well. Do it quickly. Get it done in a reasonable period of time, and don't drag this stuff out by sequencing the issues and the actions one after the other. You have a period of time. Do your job. It's an amazing concept of asking the bureaucracy of this nation to actually do their job, but it's important. Yes, it was passed in the last session by an overwhelming bipartisan vote. It's a bipartisan bill. The fact that the Senate did not take it up is another indictment to Senate leadership, admittedly an oxymoron, but it's another indictment for the Senate leadership for ignoring the significant issues that we have to face in this nation. It's another indictment that they should actually do their job. Just because the Senate leadership decides to sit on these type of issues does not mean we have to sit on them as well. This is something we have to have, and it needs to go over to the Senate. If it has to go over every week to the Senate until the Senate finally decides to actually do something, then that is our responsibility, and we should do it. I reserve the balance.
Gentlemen, the House is reminded not to make characterizations of leadership in the other body. Gentleman from Florida.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to yield 3 minutes to my good friend from Oregon, the distinguished ranking member of the Committee on Natural Resources, Mr. DeFazio.
Thank the gentleman. Great name. We're really good at particularly messaging around here, particularly on the Republican side. It's got a great name, National Strategic and Critical Minerals Production Act of 2013. Now, we've heard just earlier that this is about things that are in critical short supply, vital for our national security, and for emergencies. None of those things are true. They could be a minuscule part of this, but what this bill does is say that any mining project anywhere on any public lands in the United States of America does not constitute a significant federal action, no matter how large, no matter how sensitive the area, no matter how proximate to, say, the Grand Canyon and national treasures, or how proximate to Yellowstone, or how proximate to some critical watershed. That's not a major federal action. So it's exempt from NEPA. That's one very big problem with this legislation. I think there's a lot of members of the public, even living in very conservative areas of the country, who would find that a little bit of overreach. And then, again, these critical minerals are not critical. Sand and gravel is now critical. Anything is critical that you can find on public land, any dirt of any sort. You're going to get an expedited process. A little bit overreach. Now, we're going to have a great amendment by Mr. Lowenthal, who will use an actual definition from the National Research Council for strategic and critical minerals. So if this is on the up and up, the other side will accept that amendment. We will have these expedited processes, which still cause us some anxiety, but they will only be for truly strategic and critical materials, not everything and anything on any public land. Now, secondly, most Americans would be appalled, those who don't already know, to learn that we give away all of the minerals on our public lands. Gold, uranium, platinum, no matter what it is, we give it away. We do not charge, unlike many Western states, unlike Native American tribal lands, unlike private lands, unlike most foreign countries, we don't charge a royalty for extracting minerals from our lands, no matter how valuable, no matter how many billions of dollars that load might be worth of platinum or gold or uranium. No charge. Give it away. Now, twice this body has passed, on a bipartisan basis historically, a modest royalty on the extraction of depletable, valuable minerals from federal lands. Been very involved in that in the past. In the summer, I went to the committee when this bill was first going to come up, the Rules Committee.
Gentleman's time has expired.
An additional minute.
Gentleman's recognized for 1 minute.
They admit there are no parliamentary issues, no scoring issues. In fact, my amendment, an 8% royalty, would raise hundreds of millions of dollars, and those hundreds of millions of dollars would be used to remediate hundreds of thousands of mines in the West that are polluting the environment, polluting our rivers. I have one in my district, foreign company. They put up their $1 million bond. Unfortunately, they left the country, and it's a $14 million cleanup. The public's going to get stuck with that. It's polluting a river, killing fish, and the public, the taxpayers, are going to have to pay for it. My amendment would have raised the resources necessary to deal with hundreds of thousands of abandoned mines in the western United States that need remediation and mitigation. But the Republicans were afraid to vote on that amendment. Some in the West know it's a problem, and they didn't want to vote against fixing the problem. And then others are just saying, hey, we should be, the government, run it like a business, except when it comes to valuable minerals. We want to give them away. We don't really care about the deficit. Thank you, Mr.
Time
Chair.
has expired. Gentleman from Utah.
Reserves.
Gentleman from Utah reserves his time. The gentleman from Florida.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. If we defeat the previous question, I'm going to offer an amendment to this rule that will allow the House to hold a vote on the Bring Jobs Home Act. This bill will help to boost the economy by encouraging businesses to bring more jobs to America and discourage companies from shipping jobs overseas. To discuss our proposal, I yield 3 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from New Jersey, my good friend, Mr. Pasquarelli.
Gentleman is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Hastings, to our chairman. I rise, Mr. Speaker, in strong opposition to the rule in the underlying bill before us today, H.R. 761. I just think it goes too far. The National Strategic and Critical Minerals Production Act of 2013. I urge my colleagues to defeat the previous question and take up this legislation, which we've worked on for a full year now, Bring Jobs Home Act, a bill which for the first time makes sure we promote insourcing of jobs and stop the corporate welfare business of outsourcing jobs. The underlying legislation would set a dangerous precedent by waiving mining projects from environmental reviews and limiting public access to the justice system itself. Pushing mining projects through the permitting process is sure to continue to downgrade and degrade our environment and create workplace situations which are definitely unsafe. But it won't solve the employment problem. Now, since that's been injected into the discussion, the legislation will simply allow our nation's resources to be used to pad the pockets of the same international corporations who ship jobs overseas. And by the way, in that process, the shipping of jobs overseas is subsidized by the federal government. We have for years helped corporations send jobs overseas. What we should be doing is helping them get jobs back to America, particularly since we see an upgrading of the past 16 months in the manufacturing sector of our economy. We're going to end with this bill to end the tax breaks that encourage companies to ship their jobs overseas. Use that to pay for tax credits for patriotic companies that want to bring jobs back to home. You want to have real job improvement? This is the way to do it. Over the last decade, we've lost 5.5 million manufacturing jobs, more than during the entire Great Depression. Our trade deficit increased by $300 billion. And during the recession, the manufacturing workforce plummeted to a near 60-year low. More troubling is that the recent studies estimates that 1/4 of American jobs are at risk.
Ms. expired.
1 minute.
Gentleman is recognized for 1 additional minute.
More troubling, Mr. Speaker, is that in recent studies, estimates that 1/4 of American jobs are at risk of being outsourced in the coming years. Now, we're not talking about chump change here. This is a lot of jobs. So let's defeat this motion so we can actually debate a bill that will end corporate welfare, that allows companies to continue to engage in outsourcing, and then get a tax cut for doing so. Instead, let's provide incentives that will grow good-paying manufacturing jobs in the USA. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back, and I thank you for
Gentleman yields back
providing
this
this
time.
opportunity.
Gentleman from Utah.
I'm going to reserve for a second.
Gentleman from Utah reserves his time. The gentleman from
Mr.
Florida.
Speaker, I would advise and ask my friend if he's prepared to close. I have no further speakers at this time.
Gentleman from Utah.
Yeah, obviously I am prepared to close. Depends on how long your closing goes, though.
I can make it go as long as you want it to go, but Mr. Speaker, with that,
I may ask you to do that.
I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Picking up from where Mr. Pascrell left off, which I wasn't intended to do until my good friend from Utah mentioned the time frame. We are on tomorrow going to vote on whether or not to cut $40 billion from the supplemental nutrition program for people in this country. And one of the measures included in that is going to be that people can only qualify for 3 months during a specified period of time if they are able-bodied people. Well, if you vote for the previous question that Mr. Pascrell offered, there may be some jobs for those people. Otherwise, what we're getting ready to do is we're getting ready to put more people in a position of needing the food stamps, and we continue to talk about jobs, but we haven't done anything on the infrastructure, and I predict even if this measure before us today were to become law, then, which it is not, but if it did by chance become law, we'd be lucky if in the course of time we had the kinds of jobs and the number of jobs that are desperately needed in this country. What is wrong with this institution? Don't we understand that we have college kids that are graduating and they can't find a job? We hire kids up here at lower than the minimum wage because they can't find jobs in the private sector. This is crazy. We can't continue doing nothing when in fact the people are suffering in this great country of ours. We have the resources, not only the natural resources that my friends would have us extract from even public lands without paying royalties, but we have the resources as a people to do the things creatively to assist us in bringing jobs here rather than sending them all over the world and causing a diminution of jobs here at home. Again, for the life of me, I don't understand why we are considering this bill today. We are considering virtually every mine on public land, including uranium and coal mines, to operate without adherence to federal environmental laws which protect public safety. Our priorities are truly in the wrong place. As I asked before, Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to oppose this rule in the underlying legislation. And, Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to insert in the text of the amendment in the record, along with extraneous material, immediately prior to the vote on the previous question.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to vote no and defeat the previous question. I urge a no vote on the rule, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Utah is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the opportunity we have of presenting this particular rule to the body. I've always appreciated the opportunity of sharing this time with the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Hastings, who is a good friend and a very colorful orator, and I always like to hear his orations here on the floor. You'll forgive me if I want to try and refocus on the matter that is at hand. For indeed, I recognize the statements that have been made by the last two speakers that deal with the significance of jobs. What we simply have to have is a policy in this country that promotes private sector jobs, not just government sector jobs. By promoting private sector jobs, we actually expand the economy and build upon that concept. That is one of the reasons why this particular bill is here. When all of a sudden you go from 30 minerals that we had to import from other areas to 61 minerals that we now have to import from abroad, that means there are a bunch of minerals that we used to be producing in good, high-paying jobs that no longer are there. So this is one of the areas that we can move our country in the proper direction, and not just simply saying, okay, let's create some kind of make-work program that actually adds particular jobs. It needs to be the right kind of jobs to move our country forward. As one person once told me that if the people sitting here is the entire universe with which we talk, we will not make ourselves rich by paying each other to take vacations. At some time, someone has to add real wealth into the equation. That's what this bill is trying to do. We have critical mineral wealth in this country. It needs to be added to the equation so that we can create those good-paying mining jobs that will then spin off into good-paying manufacturing jobs in the private sector. That's everything we are attempting to do. I would like to make one issue and try and put it to rest in some case as to the idea that these companies who would be receiving benefit from these are somehow getting off and not paying taxes or royalties. They are not paying federal taxes, but sometimes we forget that we're not the only equation out there. Every one of these pays significant royalties and severance taxes to state and local governments. The federal tax that is proposed by some of the amendments to this bill would be on top of that. It would be a form of double taxation. Its goal would be to raise money, which is a nice goal, but simply because you found a potential effort for the federal government to try and raise more money doesn't mean you need to rush into that, especially when it has a negative aspect somewhere else. It would have a negative aspect on the state and local governments. It would also have a negative aspect on those companies that some people don't want to have any empathy for the situation they are in. If you actually put an additional federal royalty on top of the state and local royalty which they are paying and the severance tax that you are paying, in a traditional company you could pass that tax burden on to the consumer. In a world market, we cannot. That just doesn't happen. It has to come out from the company itself. The companies who are involved in here have clearly said that they are not opposed if we could put some kind of net proceeds on. But these kind of proposals that we'll be hearing in the debate today are not net proceeds tax. They are an unparalleled, an unprecedented gross tax. Nothing has ever gone to that level in which the amendments would try to put on this program. So once again, what we're trying to ask you to do is look at this in the overall view of what we are trying to do to develop real and good private sector jobs. And the underlying element still goes back to the fact that, look, what we need is to go through the permitting process, but to do it in a way that is legitimate. It should not have to wait 7 to 10 years to actually permit something. That is just unrealistic. I apologize, Mr. Speaker, I'm an old school teacher. As a school teacher, we had 9 months to do something. If you couldn't get it done in 9 months, you didn't get it done. There was no idea of just postponing it to a future date. If a principal came to me and said, we're going to have our testing done on Tuesday for the standardized test, I couldn't say, no, I can't do that. Let's wait for 2 weeks, and maybe I'll be ready to help you with the testing data. In a public education, any education system, when the time is up, the time is up. You have to do the work, and you back schedule to make sure that you actually do the work. That happens in almost every element of society except for here in government. When I was in the state legislature, we had a constitutional end of that state legislative date. We had 45 days to make a decision. Often those decisions are not easy, and you make the better of the bad choices that you have, but we had to make a decision. I contrast that with what is happening here in the United States government, in which the Forest Service was asked to do a study on a potential bridge that we could transfer from the federal ownership over to state ownership, and they said, yes, in about 4 years we would be able to do that study. 4 years to do a simple study? We give ourselves these unreasonable and unexcusable time references, and we do it all the time. I had a bill that was passed a couple of years ago in which mandated that a certain agency of government had to give a piece of property over to the local entity of government. Congress passed it. They mandated it. Now here, 2.5 years later, the agency still has not transferred that land. They are going through their surveys. They are taking their time. Even the local government had to pay for all these time-consuming surveys. What Congress mandated 2 years later still has not happened. That's unrealistic. In the private sector, no one would tolerate that. In our state government, no one would actually tolerate that. In the education community, no one would tolerate that. Yet we look at that as the norm, 7 to 10 years as an average to actually permit these things. That is why what this bill is trying to do is say, look, go through the process, use the NEPA process, but do it in a fair and rational way, and make a decision. You don't drag things out just for the fun of dragging things out. If the decision is yes, fine. If the decision is no, fine, but for heaven's sakes, make a decision. Some elements of government, who I will not make caricatures about, even if it's true, some elements seem to like to drag out decisions. This is an area that should not be. And so this simply says, if you're going to deal with this area, you got 30 months. 30 months to make a decision. You can do that in 2.5 years. There is no reason why it cannot be. We are doing this in other areas of the government. The President, in his executive order, said this has to be the way we move forward. This bill moves us forward. This bill does a good thing. It was right that it passed in the last session by a huge bipartisan vote because it's the right thing to do. It's the right message. It's the right program. It moves us forward. It's the right thing to do this year. And we will continue to push this until at some point we have succeeded in making sure that we're moving forward with hard deadlines so that decisions are made and we're not just piddling and waiting and delaying time after time. Mr. Speaker, this is a very good bill. It was a good bill last time we passed it. It's still a good bill. We need to pass this bill again. It's also a very good rule. It's a fair rule. It's a rule for which we can be proud. And I would urge my colleagues to make sure that we vote for this rule so we can move forward on a bill that should have been passed by both bodies a long time ago, but we need to once again start this process and continue going forward because it is the right thing to do. It will provide us with resources. It will provide us with jobs. It will provide us, more importantly, with decisions. Finally, we can actually have an agency that makes a decision in a timely manner. With that, Mr. Speaker, I will now yield back the balance of my time, and I move the previous question on the resolution.
The gentleman yields back his time.